Welcome, everybody. This is Ed Mead. I'm the founder of Vuber and here in a personal capacity, really, this time to talk to Richard Blanco. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for coming along.
My pleasure.
For those of you who don't know who Richard is, if you've ever been to any kind of get-together where landlords are talking about how to professionalise themselves or looking for a bit of advice, the chances are that Richard will have been one of the people you listen to. And he is actually the London representative of the National Landlord Association. Not only that, but if you YouTube him, you'll see he's done quite a lot of programmes, professional punter work, this sort of thing. He's a very good name in the very well known name in the landlord business, really, and it's an area that I don't know much about. So, just a little bit, Richard. Just give us a little bit of a qualification from the landlord perspective in terms of the size of your own portfolio and a little bit perhaps about how you got into it first. We were talking on air when we were off air a little bit about how you didn't like doing things in other people's time. So just a little bit of background on who Richard Blanco is.
Yes, okay. Well, yes, I'm a landlord with properties across 6 London boroughs. So I've got 13 properties and I house, I think it's 32 people. I've got shops as well as houses and flats. So not a huge portfolio, but, you know, gives me a fair amount of work. And with it being in London, obviously, you can build up a sort of bigger size capital in terms of a bigger size portfolio in terms of capital with fewer properties. I actually began in theatre and dance many years ago. So I was a community dance worker for London Borough of Lewisham, or dancer in residence actually. So and I set up Greenwich Dance Agency as it was then, and was director of that. So I ran a dance centre and venue, and I worked as an arts consultant as well. I then did an MA in theatre, and I did quite a lot of performance artwork, which is something I was very interested in. And meanwhile, I decided to start buying property because I was lucky and I bought a flat in Hackney, which went up a lot in value. And I was actually working as a consultant at the time, specialising in HR and diversity stuff. And I gradually started to build up the portfolio then. And it was the kind of classic model where I would buy something at auction that needed refurbishment. I'd get it quite cheaply. I'd spend money on it, refurb it, and then refinance it, and that would give me some capital then to buy another property. And I would also be kind of squirreling away any rent that I got to kind of get more of a deposit.
So how did you get the confidence to do that in the first place? Because it's quite a big jump to go to an auction and buy your first property. You really need to know what you're doing.
It's true, yes. I always say you have to have nerves of steel, really, to buy at auction. How did I get the confidence? I guess through research. I'm a great one for researching before I do anything. So I would be found sort of hanging out at Waterstones late at night, reading through all the property books, eking out a coffee, for several hours.
Any books you'd particularly recommend?
We're talking 2003-04, so it was a long time ago, and most of those will be out of date.
Well, actually, a lot has moved on, and we'll come on to this because, of course, the job, which is really what it is of being a landlord, has changed so much. And someone the other day told me that there are something like 150 different pieces of legislation that landlords need to comply with. In fact, I think it might have been you who said that when we were on air the other day talking about something.
Quite possibly.
I mean, that's a lot to take at risk. And my understanding is that as many as 70% of landlords out there are amateur landlords. They don't take necessarily professional advice. We'll come on to your advice as to self-managing or agents or whatever it is, or how you look after yours. But as you said, it has changed an enormous amount over the last, 2003, crikey, that was 15, 16 years ago. So was that when you started then?
That's when I started, yes. So, I was a great kind of spreadsheet man, and I would do lots of research and see hundreds of properties before I would actually buy one,
Yeah, well, I think that's lesson one, listeners, isn't it? I mean, do your research. Because I think that certainly for people of my generation, I'm a little bit older than you, not a lot, a little bit older than you. And the impression of landlords, certainly when I was growing up, was always a slightly negative one. And I think people had come from the come from the sort of Rachman, Nicholas van Hoogstraten. People had this terrible image of landlords. And I think some of the legislation that's changed over the years has been good because it has tightened up the industry. But what's your view on professionalisation? Because when I've heard you talk in the past, you've been very passionate about professionalising the industry. And of course, that is what the government claims it's trying to do with all the recent tax changes and the changes to wear and tear allowances and all this sort of thing. Do you think landlords are more professional now than they used to be?
I think, excuse me, I'm happy with some of the regulation because I think there probably are too many people who don't behave in a professional enough way, and they, of course, affect the reputation of the rest of us. There are quite a lot of accidental landlords out there as well who have come across a property and don't really understand the legislation around it. I think there was a real turning point, though, actually, when George Osborne brought in the Section 24 tax changes, because they were fundamentally unfair and are unfair because we're taxed on our turnover. In a way, it is trying to penalise smaller landlords, and it's kind of saying, well, if you don't want to be penalised tax-wise, then set up a limited company and buy that way. And
just to interrupt you, sorry, Richard, just so that some of our listeners understand, the Section 24 changes were brought in a few years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, and they were designed to stop landlords basically being able to claim relief at full rate of tax, stopping them being able to claim wear and tear allowances on furniture and white goods and this sort of thing. But they were being phased. So it's worth mentioning that for a lot of people, the changes that were instigated by George Osborne in the Section 24 so-called changes to the Second Finance Act are only now beginning to bite.
Exactly, yes. We're in year 2 at the moment. So tax bills that people are paying on the 31st of January are form year 2. It's been phased over 4 years, so we've got 2 more years to go. And I'm hearing more and more from landlords about this now because they're starting to feel the effect. What he was trying to do there was put the brakes on buy-to-let. And he also made it easier for first-time buyers to come into the market with Help to Buy, etc. But what really irks me is we also then had the additional stamp duty, that's the 3% additional stamp duty, and the Prudential Regulation Authority bringing in regulation of buy-to-let mortgages, including special underwriting standards for portfolio landlords, so that's landlords with 4 or more properties. So for me, those 3 amounted to really slamming the brakes on the sector and setting in train quite a negative narrative, really, around landlords.
And those prudential changes you were talking about, this is about rental coverage of the mortgage payments?
That's right. So the introduction of stress tests, which are too high, really. And basically in London, it means that you can only borrow about 60% now, maximum, really.
And what is the percentage that you need as coverage?
The minimum is 125% at 5.5%. So the idea is that your rent must cover 125% of the mortgage payment as if you were paying an interest rate of 5.5%. Now, most buy-to-let mortgages really are in a range of sort of 1.3 to 2.5, that sort of area. So they're a long way from 5.5%. And the other thing is, if you are a 40% taxpayer, you will be stress tested at 145%. Times 5.5%. So that really makes it quite tough to get a mortgage, certainly in London, over about 60% loan to value. Now, in some ways, it's positive for those of us who have remained in the market because it's really cut back on competition. The market feels very different now, certainly in London. It's a bit bubblier in the Northwest and the Midlands, etc. There's still quite a lot of activity in those areas as far as I understand it. So some landlords argue it's quite good in London and the South East because you're able to pick up a bargain. You've not got as much competition. Depends whether you think prices are going to continue to drift downwards. So those changes really hammered landlords in a way that's over the top, I think.
But certainly in my previous guise at Douglas and Gordon, that business started in the late 50s very much as a rental. It started by managing rentals and finding places for people to rent, which wasn't very fashionable in those days. And I think for a lot of people, rentals have always been considered to be a sort of slightly second-hand sort of way of living. But actually, with this professionalisation of landlords, do you think that renting in 2019 is a better proposition? Do you think tenants are better treated now than they were when you started in 2003?
I think if you were always a good landlord and you cared about your tenants and wanted to provide good homes, I'm not sure very much has changed really. But, we do have to have things like gas safety certificates. We're going to have electrical safety certificates at some point. And licensing in some cases means that the poorer quality properties are being inspected and those landlords are being forced to improve. So I don't think it's so much about the offer improving. I think it's about the lower end of the market being forced to pull its socks up, and that's quite right. The problem is that landlords will say the good ones are having to pay for the bad ones because it's the good ones that are paying the licensing fees and all that local authority bureaucracy that goes with it in order to find the bad landlords. And you could argue that local authorities could have found the bad ones anyway.
But it's not that the licensing isn't universal, is it? It's some councils that do it and some don't, number one. And if you are a council that does it, as you say, you've somehow got to go and find the landlords that aren't. So how would they even begin to go about doing that?
Well, we talk about intelligence-led enforcement at the National Landlord Association. So there's lots of data out there to help you find problem households or homes where there might be issues around property standards. And, some people talk about the dirty curtain test, where you can literally walk down a street and look at which properties might have problems and knock on the door and find out what's going on.
But isn't the problem these days that if you did, let's use the dirty, I love that expression, dirty curtain test, and you do a search for that property and it's an offshore company or it's a company that's very difficult to get behind.
Yes.
I mean, how far will a council, even if you are unlucky enough, depending on how you look at it, to be a landlord of a property where a council is trying to enforce this licensing. It just strikes me that it's bearing in mind that I think there are something like 5.5 million landlords in the UK at the moment, something like that.
Gosh, I've not heard that high a number.
No, well, maybe that's wrong. What is the right number,
do you think? Around 2.3 million.
Is it 2.3? Okay, so it's still a huge number. It's still a huge number. And which percentage of those do you think are covered by licensing at the moment?
Oh, that's pretty tricky. I mean, it's a big issue in London and in East London, where all of the East London boroughs now have licensing. So I'm particularly affected by it.
Okay, because that's your neck of the woods.
Yes.
Okay, well, you're a good example. I mean, I think that's why we're talking. I think you're a great example of someone who is trying to do it professionally. So let's talk a little bit about the way you go about it. So, I mean, obviously one of the things that's changed recently to a very large extent is the ability for landlords to use technology more to manage in terms of reference checking and producing all the paperwork, etc., etc. These companies like Open Rent, UPAD, some of these people that produce the boilerplate templates of agreements, and they will do the checking for you. Do you advocate using that yourself, or do you use agents or a mix?
I mostly manage properties myself, and I will use agents to find tenants sometimes. And I tend to still use high street agents, actually, that I've got a relationship with. But I have used some of the online agencies before, like UPAD and so on. And, it's rumoured that as agents become more regulated, that actually tenant find will go more online and high street agents will tend to do more management. So who knows what might happen in future. In terms of using apps and stuff like that, I get a bit worried about using them sometimes because I kind of prefer having my own spreadsheets and things like that to manage stuff myself. But I'm sure more and more people will start using technology and apps as the years
I
go
can't
on.
help feeling that it's a slightly generational thing again. I mean, certainly my kids who are 25, if they were ever lucky enough, heaven forbid, to own their own properties and rent them out, I think they would feel far more comfortable doing things via an app, whereas perhaps those of us who've been around for a bit like to have someone at the end of the phone that we can talk to or shout at or whatever.
Well, I mean, I will use things like WhatsApp and email and so on. Like when I brief my tenants when they move in, I say, when you report a repair, please email me a photograph of it as well and stuff like that. So I'm certainly using technology in those ways. My builder's got a Dropbox on his phone, and I put all of his job sheets and photos of the repairs into Dropbox, and that's how he accesses them, because he's not very good with paperwork, So I do use technology. But I think the issue with apps and stuff like that is lots of entrepreneurs like to do things in their own way, I think. And an app forces you to do it in the way that the app wants you to do it. So I think that's why some of us struggle a bit with apps. We've had lots of kind of offers at the National Landlord Association that help you manage rent and rent payments and stuff like that. And I'm always surprised at how many people don't take them up, actually. And I think it is because we like to do them in our own way,
I think that's always been one of the issues about property is it's estate agency and lettings agency is still one of the last great bastions of the entrepreneur. 80% of estate agents are one or two offices. They're very entrepreneurial, which is a benefit has always been a benefit on one side, but it's a negative from the point of view that they're very resistant to change, to embracing too much modern technology. I mean, the problem is if you're a one-office operation, lettings is very much now the only bit of most estate agents' operation that accrues value because it's a consistent income. But I think they find it very, very difficult to know which way to jump from a technological perspective, because if they spend too much money, they might go bust. So they tend not to. So they bury their head in the sand. They stay with their heads buried in the sand. And I think it's some of those that you mentioned earlier, that the sort of tail wags the dog a bit sometimes with lettings agents. And it's the bad one or two landlords or lettings agents that give the entire industry a bad name. And actually, you and I both know that the vast majority of landlords and lettings agents are fantastic, and they've got no interest in bad publicity. And these days, with reviews and things like that, they can get clobbered so quickly.
Yes.
And lettings agents, I mean, I still sit on the Property Ombudsman Industry Forum. It's now a unitary board, but I used to sit on the board of the TPO for a very long time. And admittedly, when lettings agents had to become part of a redress scheme, they suddenly accelerated the number of complaints. But of course, lettings is a very immediate and it can often be a very emotional business. When you move in and something's not there, you just get immediately fired up about it. So you tend to manage that type of thing yourself.
I do. And what I think is key there, I think a really valuable asset in my business is my relationship with the tenant. I did have an assistant for a while, and then she left, and some of my tenants complained that they didn't like it whilst I had an assistant because they lost that direct contact with me. And I kind of learned a lot from that, really. And, me popping around as I did to see a leak in a property today and to look at the oven means that I just spend a bit of time with the tenant, find out what's going on, have a quick look around and see what else is going on, and just get a feel for things. And, that's worth that 15-minute visit can be worth so much.
No, I'd agree with that. And I mean, turning just quickly to your representation of the sort of London bit of the National Landlords Association, I mean, I've always been a great believer that the best people to help other people are people doing the same thing. So from a landlord's perspective, the National Landlords Association is a forum for landlords to discuss topics with each other.
Yes, it's a kind of trade body in a way that you can become a member of, and we've got over 40,000 members, and we're in contact with I think 70 or 80,000 landlords in total. And so you can use all of the services that are on offer, often at discounts. You can use the advice line as well, which is invaluable, I think, for lots of landlords. And then you can also go along to local meetings. So I'm one of 3 representatives in London, and we run meetings across Greater London, and then there are meetings across England and Wales.
And these are for existing and maybe even wannabe landlords to come along to and get some advice, and because that strikes me as being a really clever way of doing things. I mean, if you want to become a landlord, nothing's going to help you more than talking to someone who's been there and done that.
Absolutely. And I would really recommend going to NLA meetings, because you meet the kind of down-to-earth end of the community, really. People who, yes, want to make a good living, but generally feel quite passionate about the work that they do and care about their tenants and want to do things properly. I think some of the other kind of meetings arenas are a bit more focused on making your first million and that kind of thing, and sometimes a bit overly commercial. So I prefer what we do at the NLA, because I think we've got our feet firmly on the ground, and the work we do is about education and trying to promote positive values, getting people to have values-driven businesses, really, and trying to promote positive role models of landlording.
Yeah. I mean, I know certainly that from certainly in the old days, 20, 30 years ago, people used to look at investing in property as a long-term proposition, and the returns that they got from their investments in property were as much from the increase in capital value over 20 years as they were from the yields. And obviously what we've seen, any landlord who rents properties in London will have seen that yields have plummeted, really, as values have gone up and rents haven't kept up. And obviously it's why a lot of people go off to other parts of the country to try and chase yield. You clearly prefer to keep stuff in the area in which you live so you can manage it and be nearby, or at least vaguely nearby.
I like to be within half an hour, really, half an hour's drive.
Well, I think that's very, very good advice, actually, because a lot of people come on to me. I remember when I was doing my slot on LBC, a lot of people used to ring up and say, I've seen a lovely investment in Spain or whatever it is, and it sounds great, but if you're going to manage a property. But to what extent do you look at your portfolio as being long-term capital value versus yield? How would you balance that up?
I was very strict on my minimum rental yield when I was buying. Actually, I've paused from buying, so it had to be a minimum of 6%. And if it was
gross or net,
that would be gross.
Gross. Okay.
So less than 6%, and I would kind of raise my eyebrows and think, should I really be buying this? It also had to be within 10 minutes walk of a tube station, and I had to be confident that I could let it to families or professional sharers. And I bought in East London at a time when you could buy for sort of 180, 200. So terraced houses, 180, 200 up to 250. It used to be up to the 250 stamp duty level that I would buy. So I thought I was quite strict on yield, but I also bought in areas where I would get some capital growth. So along the Crossrail corridor through East London, and just generally in areas that I thought were up and coming. And, often you have to be a bit brave and buy somewhere that's a bit grotty in the hope that it's going to improve.
No, sure. But that's really encouraging to hear that someone like you, who's a professional landlord, recognises the necessity to look at the long-term growth potential as much as the income. Because I think a lot of people read too many Daily Mail headlines and think that, this country is full of amateur landlords who are getting 90% loan-to-value mortgages and desperately trying to live off the income from their rentals, which is just not the way it is. It's just
no. I mean, you should absolutely look for rental yield and capital growth. I think. I mean, that's the best strategy, and it's certainly. I've got, my loan-to-value is quite modest now, and because I bought at times when properties are reasonably cheap in these areas, and they have gone up. I know I have friends who bought through sale and rent back before it was banned, sort of pre-credit crunch, and the problem with that was they would just buy properties wherever they got the opportunity to buy. So they've ended up buying in areas where there's no capital growth, where the property was a bit run down because actually the person who owned it couldn't afford to improve it.
They're a bit blinded by the original sort of shining. Sounds great, certainly, SPAC. The person's living there and they just stay there.
You've got your ready-made tenant,
but you're sort of blinded by that and don't look at the longer term.
Yes, and by buying at auction as well, it means that you can refurb and get that property right up to spec from the word go, and that's also going to attract a good tenant.
Yeah.
That's been my strategy.
Just to take you back and put you on the spot a bit there, I noticed you said you've paused buying at the moment. Is that because you've been trying to get your loan to value down, or you're a bit worried about capital growth in the near future, Brexit, heaven knows what? Well, what's the reason why you've paused?
There always seem to be times in the cycle, I think, where it feels like we might be coming to the end of the cycle and prices are going to retreat a bit. And it feels a bit like that to me at the moment. Going to auctions in 2015, 2016, they were too busy. Prices were being pushed up too high. too many people were trying to buy, and the rental yields were well below my minimum 6%. So those were all messages to me that now isn't a good time to buy. So I'm not someone who would just buy for the sake of it because you've got to keep buying. So that's partly why. I think also the uncertainty of Brexit, just reviewing my tax situation, what to do in future. I'm not sure whether to restructure. A lot of people, well, something like 12 or 13% of landlords, according to NLA research, are thinking of restructuring.
That's because of Section 24 changes.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people are looking at LLPs and limited companies, etc. So I'm kind of sitting on the edge, really.
And will your income, because of Section 24, actually go negative, or will you still stay on the positive side?
No, I'll definitely stay on the positive side. I mean, I made sure that my portfolio is very profitable because, I just felt that was important, really. What's the point in having a portfolio that's not profitable?
So what are the choices then? You said 12 or 13%, says LLPs to turn themselves into companies. Someone the other day, we had actually a guy called Tom Tennanton here the other day, who is the chief executive of a residential REIT, which was an interesting proposition. I mean, he is offering landlords the opportunity to swap their properties into a REIT to keep the income going. And then, of course, they can roll up their CGT liabilities. And so there are other alternatives that seem to be coming. Are there any more that you've heard of? What are the alternatives that you've come across?
The main one is the hybrid LLP limited company model, where you can also it's quite complex, and it will typically cost you around £15,000 fee to go into it.
And annually, what would that cost on top to keep that maintained?
And it depends which scheme you use. There are various schemes around. So some of the schemes will charge a kind of monthly fee, and some don't. And you can just use your own accountants, etc., to maintain it.
But you probably need to have a few properties to make that worthwhile, don't you?
I would have thought so, yes. Yeah, I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who said that his tax bill is going to go up by $15,000 a year. So he's thinking, is it worth spending $15,000 on restructuring? But there are worries that there could be a test case that goes through the courts that, questions whether or not these schemes are acceptable. The housing market might be too adversely affected, of course, by Section 24, so the government might change the tax arrangements in some way. I mean, I'm not sure they'd ever roll it back. I feel like we're stuck with them for a generation. But they might bring in more favourable tax arrangements for accredited landlords. There might be a landlord register in future, or who knows what could happen. So I'm a little bit wary of restructuring. One attractive thing is around resetting the value of the properties for capital gains tax purposes. So that certainly is attractive to people like myself who've had good capital growth and are facing a very big capital gains tax bill if I ever sell in my lifetime. So yeah, there are some dimensions that make it more attractive, regardless of how much tax you're going to pay.
I think it's a fascinating subject to talk about. I think we could be sitting here talking all day, and I would continue to learn, because I think it is such it's a potential minefield. But you and I both know perfectly well that certainly we've now been 10 years in this low interest rate environment. People have been looking for other ways to invest their money.
Very fortuitous period for landlords, really, in terms of interest rates, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst people have continued to infer, well, particularly the Bank of England have been continuing to infer that interest rates are going to go up, it just doesn't look like that's going to happen. I've been saying for ages that they're not going to change. And they don't appear to be looking as if they're going to change in the near future.
No, I think the next change is touted for kind of September 2019, autumn time. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if that shifted to 2020.
I mean, I think they overshot by going down to 0.25%, 0.5%. I mean, I still can't get used to the fact that they're so low, but it has been over 10 years now. They've been at these levels. It is absolutely
and none of us could have foreseen that. I mean, we've been incredibly lucky, really.
Yeah. I do remember one landlord client of mine who had a revolving deal with his bank, where he was paying 0.85% below base as his figure. And I do remember after the base rate went down to 0.5%, he did consider sending a bill to his bank saying, I'd like to have the 0.35% paid, please. I think it did catch an awful lot of people out, I have to say.
Yes.
Okay, well, look, really appreciate your insights, Richard. Is there anything, just as a sort of last talk, really, as a last sort of comment, do you have anything that you'd like to say as a landlord, or to tell people out there who are thinking of getting into property? Would you say, yeah, go for it, no, don't touch it with a barge pole? Where would you be on that?
I think if you're thinking of getting into it now, you need to have your head screwed on. You really have to understand all the tax implications. And you're going to have a lot more cash than I had when I started, probably, because you'll need much bigger deposits if you're hoping to get finance. Really, you're looking.
What sort of deposits are we talking about now?
Well, if it's London, you're looking at 40%. Really, outside of London, probably the 25%, which is what we've become familiar with over the years. It was 15% when I started out, and I would steer clear of 85% buy-to-let loans because the interest rates are so much higher. You might as well get a 75% loan and get a much better interest rate, and maybe try and get some of the deposit elsewhere through joint ventures and so on. I would say don't turn your nose up at traditional buying a property with a mortgage and through straightforward buy-to-let lending. Sometimes people think they need to go for lease options and all these kind of exciting mechanisms, and nothing beats really just that straightforward traditional buying a property through a mortgage.
Houses, flats, HMOs, what do you think, what have you discovered is your safest option?
Well, I prefer buying freehold because I like to have control over the property. If you buy a terraced house or a townhouse, you can potentially go up into the loft at some point or extend it, do a side return, something like that. So it's got potential for development. And if the Victorian house has got 2 separate receptions, then one of the receptions could be used as a bedroom. I'm not a huge fan of bedsit multi-let HMOs, but I quite like HMOs where I've got a group of sharers on one AST, and having 2 receptions is helpful for that. So that's always been the sort of property that I've favoured. 1930s type houses are also brilliant because often they're quite good for extending and going into the roof on. So you sort of go up and
they
back.
tend to be better built. I rather agree with you there. They tend to be better built.
Yes, I mean, those Victorian terraces are often thrown up in a hurry, I think, really. And we're very lucky they're still standing. I think it's that lime mortar, that kept them together.
Yes, I'd love to have been around at the time and ask the builders what the life expectancy was, the built-in life expectancy of those Victorian
I remember
buildings.
taking up the ground floor on one property to find that one wall had no foundations at all. So it was just leaning on the front wall.
Okay. Well, look, I think that's great advice. I know you have your own website. Which is, I think, Richard Blanco, BLANCO.com.
That's right, yes, and we're just rebuilding that, actually, yes. And you can also see some of my House Hunters International episodes on YouTube. If you put into YouTube House Hunters International London, then quite a few of my episodes will come up. And I've also got a podcast called Inside Property as well, so that's at insideproperty.org.uk. And I'd love to encourage people to join the National Landlords Association too. And we're doing a 30% discount actually in February, so if people are interested, then do call up and join.
Well, after people have been feeling poor over the Christmas period, a 30% discount sounds like a good idea. Well, listen, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I've enjoyed it every time I meet you and talk to you, and I would encourage people, if they want any kind of advice on being a landlord from someone who's really been there and done that. You've survived for 15, 16 years building a portfolio at a time when, frankly, a lot of people would say it hasn't been that easy and particularly challenging perhaps over the next couple of years as the Section 24 changes bite. I'd like to say thank you, Richard, for coming in, and the best of luck for the future.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.